Good morning. Um, I bring you greetings this morning from our Bishop Provisional, Bishop Melissa Skelton. She wanted me to let you know that she is continuing to hold this congregation in her prayers as she can hold all of our diocese in her prayers, especially during this time of our transition. So, Jesus was a man of words and action. And today, those words and actions collide in an explosion of overturned tables and a cacophony of cascading coins. And we wonder, almost want to scratch our head and say, I'm sorry, did somebody replace Jesus, meek and mild, with this guy? But no, it really is Jesus. But it's not Jesus out of control. I have seen in my own life, and I suspect many of you have seen, when anger is out of control and the chaos and destruction and injury that can take place. This is not Jesus out of control. In fact, it is very clear that Jesus specifically chose that moment and that place to do what he did. This is not Jesus coming in, getting ticked off, and losing it. That's not what's going on. So, what's happening here? Well, put yourself in the place of the people. It's Passover time. And Passover time in the city of Jerusalem, the population literally doubled. We think that it went from maybe about 75,000 to 150,000. Suddenly, people are coming in from all over the Middle East, from the Mediterranean, and they're all coming because the Passover feast is so important. It's so central. It is the remembrance of how God saved God's people. In fact, that very sentence even appears in our Easter Vigil all these hundreds of years later. So it's critical. So all these folks are coming in, but now you're coming from all over the place. You're probably not traveling with a lamb. You're probably going to get there and say, okay, I need to get a lamb for the Passover. And because I'm in Jerusalem and I want to offer the sacrifices that have been required and I have the opportunity to do so, I also want to do and make other sacrifices. Well, wouldn't it be convenient if all of that stuff was in one place? I mean, wouldn't it be cool if you could, you're traveling in, you're coming, and you could just go right to the temple, you could get your Passover lamb, and you could get whatever animals you wanted for the sacrifices that you were going to make during that time, all in one spot, and then you'd be right there at the temple, and then the sacrifices could happen, everybody's happy. We would call that a good business practice today. That's convenience economics. What's wrong with that? Feels like a good idea. Oh, but what if I'm coming from way out of town and the currency that I've got doesn't match the currency that I've needed if I'm going to buy this lamb or this cattle? Wouldn't it be cool if I could just have a foreign exchange office right there? Wouldn't that be cool? Well, that's what they did. They said, well, let's have a foreign exchange office right there. You come in, you exchange, you get the local currency, you get your shekels, and you buy the animals you need. Everybody's happy. Everything's cool. Oh, did I mention that there's a little money exchanging hands in other places too? The chief priests are getting a little cut of the action. And, the prices? Well, supply and demand. I realize that you're going to have to pay 3 times as much to get this lamb today as you would have to get the same lamb last week, but, welcome to capitalism, even before there was a capitalism. I think, however, we would call it price gouging, taking advantage of people. So already there's a hint that something is a little off in this business. And then there's the big problem, the problem that Jesus is actually the most upset about. It's the conversion of God's house into a marketplace. Religion reduced to money-making. That's at the heart and core of it. The idea of even coming to the temple was to be the place where you encountered the living God. There's a whole huge piece of the dedication of the temple when it's first made, where there's a long prayer that Solomon makes, and at the end of it, the glory of God comes down and fills the space. It's the place where God will encounter God's people. It's the place to come when everything is falling apart. It's the place to come and hear how God saved God's people. And now you get there, and you can't hear what's going on for all of the stuff that's going on around you. There are even people making shortcuts through the temple, trying to get their cattle and their sacrifice there quickly so that they could get in while the price was still hot. All this is going on, and Jesus is saying, but this is supposed to be the place where people encounter God. This is the place where rabbis would teach. If you could imagine, if you could reduce the temple down to the size of this building, and it's kind of like making a stadium complex come all the way down to the side of this building. It's big. But if you could do that, imagine if right over here, in the middle of the Eucharist, there was somebody selling bread. Now, you need bread for Eucharist, right? But, they're over there, and they got to get your attention. Excuse me, priest, we got some cheap bread over here. You might want to use this. Can you just come over here and use this? You other folk, don't worry about it. We're going to get this. Oh, you don't have any money right away. That's okay. You can use your church credit. You guys are good for it. Now, imagine this going on in the midst of a Eucharist, where people are trying to encounter the living God, the God who saves God's people. So Jesus comes in, sees this complete disregard for what's going on, and chooses this moment for a prophetic action. I have to throw that word in there because this is key to what Jesus is doing. It's a prophetic action. There are three parts of a prophetic action. One is that it speaks and it calls out the injustice that's happening at the moment in the name of God. Calls out and says, wait a minute, this is not God's will. It calls that out and says, this thing that's going on right here, right now, in this place, is against what God's desire is for God's people. That's the first thing a prophetic act does. It calls out the injustice of the moment in the name of God. It's not the only thing it does. A prophetic action also connects to the past and what God has said and done in the past. It shows up in this passage. Remember when the disciples see Jesus at work, they think of a passage from the Bible. They think, wait a minute. We remember one of the prophets said, zeal for your house consumes me. They are remembering and they're connecting this with something that God has said all along. And even more than this, there's a passage that doesn't get quoted, but it's alluded to. There was an expectation that when the Messiah came, the first thing that the Messiah would do would go to the capital city, go to Jerusalem, and straighten stuff out, starting at the temple. Where did they get that idea? Well, the prophet Zechariah just simply said, the Lord will come suddenly to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant that you long for. And he will sit as one who purifies silver, and he will purify the priests, starting right there at the heart of the temple. So there was an expectation that the Messiah would do something. So when Jesus comes in and does something, there are people who are saying, oh, wait a minute, what's this about? That's why he's asked that question about doing a sign. That's not the question I would have asked if I had seen somebody throwing over tables and pouring out money. I think, my question might have been, what's the quickest way out of here? But they ask him this because they're thinking, is this a prophetic action of the one whom God has sent? Could it be that you might be that person? And then he gives them the ultimate sign. And it becomes the third thing that a prophetic act does. It points forward. to what God is going to do. And so he tells them, you're looking for the sign? Here comes the sign. Listen loud and clear. He's got everybody's attention. Tear down this temple. I will build it up in 3 days. Now, you might think, well, Jesus was saying stuff like that all the time. So, did that make an impact? It did. You want to know how big of an impact it made? The impact was so big that people remembered it when they arrested him. That was actually the charge. He said something against the temple. Well, what did he say? I think he said, if you tear this down, I'll build it up. Or maybe he said, I will tear it down and build it up. Or maybe he said, I'll tear this down and build up something else. I'm not exactly sure, which is why they couldn't actually convict him on that evidence. But they remembered that he said something about the temple. Now, we have a huge hint. You can see John sort of saying, okay, big hint. Jesus is talking about his death and resurrection. Big hint. And so there is a sense that God is up to something in the future that no one even anticipates. So this is a prophetic act. Calls out the present moment, harkens back to what God has said and done, points ahead to what God is doing. Well, good for Jesus. Now that we've heard all that, we can go home and say, well, what did you learn in church today? I learned about prophetic acts. Well, wonderful, but what about us? As followers of Jesus, we also are called to prophetic action. Now, in case everybody's going to get scared and saying, oh, no, she wants to lead us in a protest march down to the bank where we're going to kick the doors in and blow up the vault. No, that's not what we're going to do. In fact, I'm going to actually tell you that you have a little practice in prophetic action already. In fact, most Sundays, you practice a prophetic act. Goodness, what could she possibly be talking about? Right here at this table, we practice a prophetic act. When Jesus first instituted this meal that we now know as Eucharist, he actually called out some stuff that was happening in the present moment. And sometimes it sneaks by us, because it's embedded even in our words of institution, but sometimes it sneaks by us. We hear Jesus say, this is my body, this is my blood, blah, blah, blah. And then there's this, forgiveness, what? Huh? What? Wait a minute, what's that doing in here? I thought we took care of that. We did that earlier in our Eucharist. Forgiveness, huh? What's this? Right there is the implication that there is wrong that needs to be called out even inside of the community of God's people. Now, don't pick up the prayer books and throw them at me here at this point, but understand that part of what we say in the midst of our absolution and forgiveness is we say, we are in need. We call out our behavior. We call out the present moment and say, this is where I failed. And as a community, we are called to do that not only in here, but out there. To call out what we see in our own society. To call out the injustice. When we see misogyny, when we see hate language, when we see racism, to call it out. Not because we are some community of do-gooders, but because we are the people of God who call this out in the name of God. That is why whenever we as a church want to talk about acting, we hearken back. We go back. What has Jesus said? What have the scriptures said? And we come from that perspective. One of the things that sometimes happens, and I often encounter this, people will say, well, Carla, you got this new fancy title. You're the Canon for Multicultural Ministry and Community Transformation. It's a lot of words. We just kind of made that up, didn't we? Because we're trying to, do something modern. That's not the point at all. We did this because we said we want an office that will help lead us in prophetic action. We want an office that will help us call out what's needed in the current moment and will help us connect with the things that God has been saying from the prophets on back. That's part of my job. So in this Eucharist, we also connect to the past. We hear the words of Jesus. We rehearse the whole story of creation. I mean, this is kind of a crazy prayer. See, I didn't grow up in the Episcopal Church. I grew up in a different church, and we had the Lord's Supper, but we didn't rehearse the whole story. When I came to the Episcopal Church, I heard us rehearse the whole story. I thought, oh, this is interesting. So this thing about communion actually connects with creation, the fall, the history of a people, the hopes, the dreams, this woman who has a child, and then to know that all of this connection from the past is part of what we draw on when we call out the present moment. And this meal also gives us a little practice in the future. You notice how when we get to the end of the Eucharistic prayer that we're no longer talking about the present? We start saying things like, and we look forward to, in communion with, we hope to enter the everlasting heritage. We're talking future stuff when we get to that. You know, the Apostle Paul was one who started that. You know, he said, we're doing this until the Lord returns. And actually it goes even back to Jesus, who said, I'm not going to eat this with you again until I drink it new with you in the coming kingdom. Always pointing forward even as he's acting in the present. So basically, if you want to know what my job is, that's my job. My job is to help the church do that. My job is to try to do it in my own life and to try to help our church do that. So some folks have asked me, Carla, you're not exactly a young person. Okay, I'll admit that. Carla, you've seen stuff go wrong for a long time. I'll admit that. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in the midst of his ministry, I was around. And when he was murdered, I was around. For the beginning of the civil rights movement, I was around. And I've had the chance to see a lot of things go wrong since then. I've had the chance to see some things go right. And I also have been around as the old evils continue to rear their ugly heads, and showing up maybe in new places, in new ways. Some folks have asked me, Carla, don't you ever just get tired? Don't you ever just see all this and say, again? Don't you ever just see all this and just want to say, I'm old now, and I'm just going to go and sit down and let somebody else do this work? Well, I'll tell you the truth. Yes. Yes. The truth is, yes, sometimes I feel that way. Yes. But then I recall what it means to be in prophetic work, which is always to be straining forward, straining ahead. When I think of the death and resurrection of Jesus, that is where, for me, the energy comes, the power of the Spirit dwells. And, yes, I do get tired, but no, I will not be quitting. No, I will not be sitting back. No, I will not be standing back. As long as God gives me a voice and the church gives me a venue, I will be speaking, calling you as God's people to ongoing prophetic action. You've already been doing it. I'm not even talking to you now about stuff that you haven't done. You've been there, you've done it, and we will keep doing it. Why should we keep doing it? I am always reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when I'm thinking about why we should keep doing it. He said, the arc of the moral universe is long. The work that we're doing is not going to be accomplished in one term of office. It's not going to be accomplished even in one lifetime. The arc of the moral universe is long. It continues. And our work is long-term work. We do it hard now because it is long-term work. But then comes the hope. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It bends that way. It bends towards justice. Why? It bends towards justice because our hands are on that arc and are pulling it. It bends towards justice because white hands and brown hands and red hands and yellow hands are pulling on that arc. It continues to bend towards justice because above all of those hands are the blood-stained hands of Jesus pulling on that arc towards justice. And so we keep on moving. We keep on trying. We say, I see how ugly it can be in the moment, but to the words of our own creed, I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. I am not done. We are not finished. In fact, I think we've just begun.